When we were in Williamsburg and Yorktown in November, we tried to find Lowe's balloon encampment, and the terrain that helped hide the balloon. According to the park ranger, Taylor Aiken, it's on the edge of the Yorktown National Battlefield. So if you look at the bottom of the map, here, that's where it's supposed to be. It happens to also be part of a private neighborhood. So it's right on the edge of the battlefield. There's a very steep ravine between the battlefield and the private property. It would have been difficult to get supply wagons through there and set up an encampment. However, there is a possible candidate for the site. We were able to get permission to get on this private property by Bill Miller, who's the president of the Williamsburg Civil War Roundtable. And he sought out the owner, whose name is Bruce Capps. And this is where we think may have been part of the area for the encampment. It's dug out, it's lower, there's water down in the base there. This area is called the Marl Ravine, and it's named for that unique substance. This stuff here is like concrete. The cliffs are made of that. We met the owner of the property, and he'll be exploring the area further with a metal detector. I asked him to look for possible iron filings. I know that's a real long shot, but maybe there's a miracle. Maybe there's a box or something of them somewhere buried or left behind. We just don't know. We'll see what he finds there. But maybe there's a container that could be discovered. I'm going to go to this map again. The directions that Taylor gave us, the park ranger gave us for the battlefield were, after the pull-off of the Virginia Militia Wayside, remember the Revolutionary War took place here too. So the Yorktown battlefield is full of signage for the Revolutionary War, but not for the American Civil War so much. They're really focused on Revolutionary. So we didn't have everything, we didn't have a lot to go on. However, what he said, it's on the edge of the Yorktown National Park, adjacent to a private neighborhood. And he said, pull off on the sign of the Militia Wayside. You could park your car and walk 400 yards southeast to find the ravine. The northern side is within the Park Service boundary. We were fortunate to have as our guide Bill Miller, as I mentioned, who is the president of the Williamsburg Civil War Roundtable, who took us there. But after 100 yards, we got out of this vehicle, and after 100 yards, there was another ravine. So we were not able to approach the actual area at this time. We were not far from Wormley Creek. I recently ordered a book, and it was supposed to come before today, and it didn't. And it's I wanted Kurt to see this, and I've already written to him that he may be familiar with the book, but I want to pass this around. This is the book by Private Sneeden, who did 300 illustrations of he did paintings of the American Civil War called The Eye of the Storm and Images of the Storm. And so the book, I have this message that the book was supposed to be there today, but it didn't get there before we left today. So anyway, but that's a great book to take a look at, and you want to know that he was a great cartographer and illustrator that put a lot of the story together for us. Do you know which brave cavalry officer did not like going up in a balloon? It was Lieutenant George Custer. He described his balloon ascent as being in a wicker basket 2 feet high and 4 feet long, and it didn't feel safe. He preferred to remain seated on the floor. And by the way, that picture that the painting that I'm sending around is Yorktown, and it shows a balloon on the right-hand side of the page. We were very fortunate to meet the curator of the Lee Hall Mansion, which is nearby, Michael Moore, who gave us a private tour. Michael and Bill have known each other for decades. One of the exhibits that caught my eye in the museum was this framed remnant of the Intrepid, the balloon Intrepid. I was thrilled to see it. The museum acquired this in 1990. It was a great surprise. And they're going to try to find out a little bit more about how they came to get it and more about the history of it. What's written around that balloon scrap is this: a piece of the observation balloon Intrepid belonging to Professor Lowe, obtained when, in May of 1862, the rope tethering the balloon broke, and Professor Lowe, in the company of General Fitz Porter, this is not accurate because Lowe was not in the balloon, right? He was not in the basket. General Fitz Porter sailed off towards Richmond at a greater speed than the Army of the Potomac was moving. General Porter had sufficient calmness to pull the valve rope and gradually descend about 3 miles from the camp, where the balloon was punctured by several trees and subsequently repaired. So that was, I was really excited to see that, as you can imagine. This is the site of it in Newport News, where another balloon called the Constitution was launched near the Warwick Courthouse. You can see there's a water source, which would have been needed to make the hydrogen. Here's a photo showing the Intrepid being replenished by a smaller balloon. And that smaller balloon is here. And they're taking the hydrogen from this balloon and forcing it into the larger balloon. And that's May of 1862. This map shows the 2 Union balloons and a single Confederate balloon. And we'll address that one later. So this is the Gazelle, and we're going to talk about her in a few minutes. I only saw this on Lance's website. I've never seen it anywhere else, so I'm glad I found this. Here's a sketch showing Lowe's balloon observing the Battle of Fair Oaks. I love this photo because we see Lowe, and you can see it's being inflated, but here's Lowe right over here, and you see his hand. He's touching, he's feeling to see how much pressure is there. I really like that, and that is on property that's been preserved by the American Battlefield Trust at Gaines Mill. This is another good look at his generators and the preparations by Union soldiers for an ascent. This is a Matthew Brady photo, and it's referred to as a U.S. Signal Corps photo. And of course, these photos are at the National Archives. While operating from Dr. Gaines' farm on the future Gaines Mill battlefield, Lowe was positioned close enough to Richmond that he could clearly see the movements of soldiers and individuals within the city. In preparation for General McClellan's assault on Confederate forces in the peninsula, Lowe was able to observe 8 miles of Confederate defenses near Yorktown. Lowe ascended at midnight with Brigadier General Heintzelman, a corps commander of McClellan. Lowe wrote about what he saw. There were bonfires that could only be seen from the balloon, and the general wondered, why were there more wagons going into the area than were going out? Lowe explained that the ingoing wagons were light and moving rapidly. The wheels were being visible as they passed by the campfire, while the outgoing wagons were heavily loaded and moved slowly. General Joe Johnston had moved thousands of reinforcements to the peninsula, but was now retreating to Richmond. Because Lowe reported this movement, McClellan was able to conduct a surprise attack the next morning to occupy Williamsburg. Here's the Eagle in a bad way during a storm, during the Peninsula Campaign. The command and control of the 7 balloons that were built went from engineer to quartermaster, back to engineer, and ended with the Signal Corps. It must have been a logistical nightmare no matter who was in control. The Union Army built 2 larger balloons, the Intrepid and the Union, which were 65 feet high with a diameter of 38 feet. Those were made with double thick silk. The fabric cost about $500, the netting $200, and the wicker basket was about $12. Each balloon also had ropes, ballast, and cables for ascending and landing. None of them were shot down, although some were fired upon by both of Confederate and Union troops. Lowe's basket was hit, but not the balloon envelope or the occupant of the basket. And he used to like to say he was the most shot at man in the war. He had a sense of humor. You can see just how small the basket is. And Lowe was standing there. This photography looks posed to me, unlike the other one that we showed with the tethered ropes. Everyone's looking at the camera except for Lowe. He's actually writing a message, and Lowe is here. He's looking down, he's writing a message. This is the balloon Washington on a Union gunboat. It's on the Potomac River near Mount Vernon, November 1861. This is not actually the first use of an aircraft carrier, however. That distinction goes to the steamship Fanny, whose balloonist, a rival of Lowe's, John LaMountain, spotted Confederate troops on the Hampton Roads, Virginia area, and reported them to Major General Butler. She was later captured and became part of the Confederate Navy. So did the Confederates also have a balloon corps? About a year later, the Confederates had one balloon for a couple of months and was the sole competitor from May to July 1862. It flew over Richmond while General Lee put up a defense there. Nicknamed the silk dress balloon, it was reportedly made from ladies' petticoats of all demographics, rich and poor alike. However, petticoats were white and cotton undergarments. The balloon envelope was made of silk. A merchant named Langdon Cheeves paid $514 in Savannah and Charleston for 20 mixed bolts of unwrapped dress silk lying in the warehouses of Kerosene and Lighting wholesale fabric merchants. The colors were yellow, green, white, dark red, and some plain and some had decorative patterns. It was sealed with a clear, vulcanized rubber coating removed from old wagon springs, which gave the silk an unusual glisten in full sunlight. It also leaked. It was tethered to a railroad car on the York River Railroad. The appearance of this balloon reinforced McClellan's fear that the Confederates were planning for an offensive against his left flank. For the second day, the Confederates were able to continue fooling McClellan south of the river by employing minor diversionary attacks to command the attention of 60,000 Federal troops while the heavier section occurred north of the river. This is the map that I showed you earlier, and I circled the Gazelle in red. She's near Richmond, positioned near the railroad, and that's one of the ways they transported her. According to historian and balloonist Kevin Knapp, between 1861 and 1863, the North made more than 3,000 such ascensions using 7 balloons. The South only had 2 balloons and made fewer than 10 flights. We were lucky to see this balloon remnant in Ohio when we were in Dayton at the Museum of the Air Force. There was no further information about it. Many years ago, I thought if John and I had $1 zillion to spare, it'd be fun to recreate a silk balloon and take it to the battlefield reenactments. That didn't happen. Here's another slide with remnants. This is from Lance's collection, and we were lucky to get this document. We were lucky to get this slide from him. He was very generous. This is a great look at another balloon remnant, and it's backlit from the archives in Richmond. The result is terrific. What was the Museum of the Confederacy is now the American Civil War Museum. This was presented by L.P. Lowe, Los Angeles, California, whose father was the late Professor T.S.C. Lowe and Chief Aeronaut of the USA, of the United States Army. The balloon was turned over to his command. I'd like to quote from an unpublished manuscript that I found about the dresses that were donated. Every old woman who had saved her wedding dress rose to the situation. Women of all grades and conditions, children, young ladies, poor women who had but a single dress, who had saved it for years, widows who had packed their bridal dress away in old cedar chests, took them out, wept over them doubtless, and marched to the nearest official, and with eyes glistening with patriotism for the cause their husbands and brothers were fighting for, handed in the dress. Some of these dresses had been seen by General Washington, King George, Napoleon, and Frederick the Great. One woman described the significance of her dress when she handed it to one of General Lee's second lieutenants with a tear running down her cheek. Yes, it is a sacred relic. Yes, it is a sacred relic. It is a dress worn by my grandmother at her wedding. General Washington's arm had pressed that sleeve many a time, and the rustle of the old silk had been heard at Arlington at his headquarters and in New York and in Philadelphia. And that, sir, continued the venerable old lady, is why I give it without a pang. I give it to my country. There were many dresses collected in Richmond. So many, the headquarters didn't know what to do with them all. Women and tailors laid them out and began to sew them together. Again, that is on Lance's website, so feel free to go and explore. That's a great website. The Confederate balloon, named Gazelle, measured about 30 feet high, much smaller than Lowe's 60-foot Intrepid. The Gazelle had a 7,500 cubic foot capacity and was assigned to engineer Captain E.P. Alexander, the same officer who would serve as Lee's artillery officer at Gettysburg the next summer. Alexander was a frequent observer from the Gazelle. She was a patriotic symbol, and Alexander used her to raise morale in Richmond. In a letter written in September of 1861 to his father, Alexander wrote, "We sent a rifle shell so near old Lowe in his balloon that he came down as fast as gravity would bring him." Once, while Alexander was in the Gazelle and Lowe was in the Intrepid on opposite sides of the Chickahominy River, they were less than 5 miles apart and out of rifle range. They could see each other through telescopes. Both did their best to keep their commanders, Lee and McClellan, informed of the activities on the ground. Lee's troops overcame the Union Army in the 7 days battle. With the end of McClellan's command came the beginning of the end of Lowe's Balloon Corps. In July 1862, the Gazelle was being transported down the James River on a tug ship, the Teaser. They were following the activities of the Union retreat. Alexander ascended on the tethered balloon at sunrise in full view of the defeated Union soldiers. Unfortunately, the tug ran aground near Union forces. As they were waiting for the tide to come in, the Maritanza, a Union gunboat, fired some shots. Alexander jumped into the water and made it to the shore. The tug and the balloon and everything that the Confederates left on board, including uniforms, belts, pistols, muskets, silver chains, bedding, clothing, letters, were confiscated. Lowe reported that the balloon Gazelle was taken to Washington and cut up and many pieces given to congressmen and others as souvenirs. In his retirement in California, Lowe still had one little piece of the faded, fragile fabric in his office. This dark red material, about the size of a playing card, was found folded in one of his letters. It's in the Library of Congress today. Alexander wrote as Confederate General E.P. Alexander, "I've never understood why the enemy abandoned the use of military balloons. Even if the observers never saw anything, they would have been worth all they cost for the annoyance and the delay they caused us in trying to keep our movements out of their sight." The romanticized stories of the balloon were told even by General Longstreet. Here's his full quote. "The Federals had been using balloons and examining our positions, and we watched with envious eyes their beautiful observations as they floated high up in the air and well out of the range of our guns. We longed for the balloons that poverty denied us. A genius rose for the occasion and suggested that we send out and gather all the silk dresses in the Confederacy and make a balloon. Soon we had a great patchwork of many ships in varied hues. The balloon was ready for the 7 days campaign. We had no gas, save in Richmond, and the custom was to inflate it there and tie it securely to an engine and run it down the York River Railroad to any point where we desired to send it up. One day it was on a steamer going down the James when the tide went out and left the vessel and the balloon high and dry on a bar. The Federals gathered it in, the last silk dress in the Confederacy. The capture was the meanest trick of the war, and one I have never yet forgiven." According to the Dayton Museum, actually the South had at least 3 balloons in service, one of cotton and 2 made from new bolts of silk of various colors. The South's inability to produce hydrogen in the field, along with material shortages, forced the Confederates to abandon balloon operations in 1863. Lowe missed the Second Battle of Bull Run in the summer of 1862 when he contracted malaria from the mosquito-infested Chickahominy River during the Peninsula Campaign. While he was recovering in D.C., he received orders on September 18th to move his balloons to Sharpsburg, which was a day after the Battle of Antietam. McClellan expressed regret that Lowe had not been present at the battle, as the balloon would have been invaluable to him during the engagement. Lowe told McClellan he was clearly frustrated at the delays in communication in his operation and felt it had to do with his being a civilian. McClellan told him he would recommend that the balloons would be made a distinct branch of the Army and that Lowe would be given a commission, which was Lowe's dream from the beginning. However, by November, McClellan was replaced by Burnside, and the balloons were not being used. At Fredericksburg, December 1862, Lowe was not given permission to fly until the day of the battle, December 13th. But the fog that morning did not dissipate until 10 a.m. There was not enough time to evaluate the unit disposition at the wall. Lowe was observing from Stafford Heights across the Rappahannock River, which was a considerable distance to the rear. He didn't need telegraph or signal flags because he could simply shout his observations down to Burnside's staff at the headquarters. General Burnside was also relieved in January 1863 after a massive defeat at Fredericksburg in December 1862. After building an aerial reconnaissance force of 7 balloons, 12 generators, and 9 aeronauts, Lowe's career with the Union Army ended badly in April 63, when Captain Comstock was given authority over the Air Balloon Corps under the command of General Hooker. Lowe's salary was reduced from $10 a day in gold, which was a colonel's salary, to $6 a day. The other crew salaries were also reduced. Eventually, even his father Clovis, who was trained in everything having to do with balloons, was also he was fired. Lowe wrote to General Butterfield, who was General Hooker's chief of staff, to tender his resignation. He focused on the financial sacrifices he'd made to keep the balloons operating. He requested reimbursement for expenses on materials and equipment he'd purchased. General Butterfield sent the letter back saying it should have gone through Captain Comstock first for approval. Lowe continued to serve for no pay through the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, where he reported heavy columns of the enemy's infantry and artillery moving up the river accompanied by many army wagons in early May. Not only were the balloons absent from Antietam, they were not in Gettysburg either. After Lowe left, there were a couple of remaining civilian aeronauts supporting the Army of the Potomac, but none of them were deployed to Pennsylvania in time for the battle. Lowe resigned May 8th, 1863. Eventually, all but 2 balloonists left. The last observation of Confederate troops was when they were moving through the Blue Ridge Mountains, June of 1863, just before Gettysburg. There are 3 points I'd like to make about the effectiveness of the balloon operations and whether or not Lowe made a difference. The first is that, by no surprise, balloon operations were dependent on the weather. Thunderstorms, snow, fog, rain, ice, and wind made a huge impact on how the balloons were handled, if they were even able to ascend. Second, Lowe didn't discuss the death and destruction that he must have observed when directing artillery fire and observing the Confederate soldiers. He witnessed horrible sights from the air. It had to have taken a toll on him. Lastly, Lowe had difficulties with the other balloonists who shared his passion. They might have accomplished a lot more together had they just gotten along. Lack of trust and little collaboration between John Wise, John LaMountain, and the Allen brothers was evident while they were trying to accomplish the same goals. And finally, I believe his most effective endeavors were in support of the Army of the Potomac when he had the ears of the commanders. Lowe's last balloon flight after the war was in November of 1865, when a couple wanted to be married in the air. But the preacher wouldn't participate in an aerial wedding. So the couple was actually married the day before the balloon ride. This is a monument in Richmond, Virginia, that lists the officers, both Union and Confederate, who made either ascensions or encouraged the use of balloons during the war. They included Union Generals Sickles, Burnside, Butterfield, Butler, Sedgwick, and the Confederate generals were Beauregard, Johnston, Longstreet, and Magruder. A couple of other tidbits. TSC was Thaddeus Sobienski Constantine. Lowe is a member of the U.S. Army Military Intelligence Hall of Fame, and the Lowe Army Heliport in Fort Rucker, now Fort Novasil, is named for him. And he was inducted into the National Balloon Museum in Iowa in 2017, and Lance attended that. TSC Lowe was nicknamed the grandfather of the United States Air Force. He continued his inventions after the war. Here's a photo of his first ice machine, which was used for refrigeration and shipping. Lowe built the first shipboard ice machine and he shipped fresh beef on a steamer from Texas to New Orleans. The beef was in good condition when it arrived, which is a remarkable achievement in 1866. He built a resort in California on Mount Lowe, of course, that would be the name, and designed a railway and a funicular to transport guests to the top. Over time, unfortunately, it has been destroyed by earthquake and fire, and nothing remains of this. But he built this. So he had an aviator granddaughter. In 1910, Lowe took his 9-year-old granddaughter to an air show. 20 years later, Frances Poncho Barnes, 1901 to 1975, beat Amelia Earhart's speed record of 181 miles per hour in 1930. Poncho's record was 196 miles per hour. Later, she broke her own record at 245 miles per hour. He's buried in Los Angeles, California in 1913. Finally, in 1987, at the age of 36, Richard Branson of the UK crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a hot air balloon, which was Lowe's dream 126 years prior. I like to call Thaddeus Lowe the Richard Branson of the American Civil War. And then these are references that I used, and a couple of websites coming up. And you're welcome to any of these. I'd be happy to share them with you. And thank you so much. And what are your questions?